Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into something exciting, so stick around till the end. King Charles walked the ceremonial line, each guardsman saluting in perfect unison, all but one. At first, the king ignored it, but then he turned back and went straight to him. Charles demanded it. He threatened him. He accused him of breaking the law of treachery, even blasphemy against the crown. And that's when the guard finally broke his silence. The words he spoke left the king frozen in place. Now, before we show you exactly what he said, make sure you are subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness will leave you absolutely speechless. London in February has this particular bite to it. The kind of cold that cuts right through your coat and makes you wish you'd stayed inside. The sky was that flat grey colour that promises nothing good, and the wind was sharp enough to make the Union Jacks snap like they were angry about something. But that didn't stop the crowds from packing in behind the rope barriers at Buckingham Palace. Tourists huddled together, phones already out, breath visible in little puffs as they waited for whatever bit of royal pageantry was about to unfold. Some ceremonial welcome for a Commonwealth dignitary. Nothing earth-shattering, but hey, when you're visiting London, you take what royal drama you can get. The thing about these ceremonies is they're supposed to run like clockwork. Every step planned, every gesture rehearsed, every single detail choreographed down to the last button on the last uniform. Or the guards stand in their perfect red line, tall as trees in those black bearskin hats, rifles held just so. When royalty walks past, they salute. It's been that way for centuries. Except today. One of them had other plans. Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer stood near the eastern end of the forecourt, like he'd been carved out of the same stone as the palace behind him. 46 years old with a kind of stillness that doesn't come from ceremonial training. It comes from places where staying calm keeps you breathing. His scarlet tunic was pressed sharp enough to cut paper. His boots so polished you could probably see your reflection in them from across the courtyard. But here's what the tourist taking his picture didn't know. This wasn't just some guy in a costume playing dress-up for the cameras. Mercer had earned his discipline in Afghan, where the wrong move at the wrong time could get your whole squad killed. He'd stood checkpoint duty under mortar fire. Cleared compounds where every shadow might be your last. 20 years of real service before he came back to ceremonial duties. And he'd never forgotten the difference between following orders and following your conscience. There was something else, though. Something that went back almost 30 years to when he was young and green and assigned to discreet security detail. The kind of jobs that didn't make it into official photos, watching from the shadows, staying invisible, keeping people safe who had targets on their backs. One of those jobs had put him close to Diana. Not the obvious protection you'd see in the tabloids, but the quiet kind. Background security, they called it. And in those final months before Paris, he'd been close enough to see what the cameras never caught. The fear in her eyes, the way her hands would shake when she thought no one was watching, the conversations she'd have in empty corridors when she thought she was alone. He remembered one night in particular, September 1997, just weeks before the end. Diana had returned from a charity event, and while the press photographed her stepping out of the car with that famous smile, Mercer had seen what happened afterward. In the service corridor, away from the cameras, she'd stopped and leaned against the wall like the weight of pretending had finally become too much. "They're not going to let me just fade away," she'd told him that night, voice barely above a whisper. "I know too much. I've seen too much." When Mercer tried to reassure her, she'd shaken her head. "No, you don't understand. There are people in this family who see me as nothing more than an obstacle to their ambitions. They've made it clear that my continued visibility is problematic for their future plans." She'd gripped his arm then, fingernails digging in through his uniform sleeve. "Then sleeve. If something happens to me, Daniel, if there's an accident or I suddenly decide to retreat from public life, remember that I never wanted to disappear. Some people get what they want by making their competition vanish. Promise me," she'd said, her voice breaking slightly. "If they succeed in silencing me, don't let them rewrite who I was. Don't let them turn me into a footnote in someone else's fairy tale," he'd promised. And for 27 years, he'd kept that promise locked away, watching as Diana's memory got sanitized and packaged into something safe for public consumption. Until today. The sound of engines cut through the February air, that low, expensive hum of the royal motorcade approaching. The crowd perked up immediately, phones rising like a digital salute as the first dark cars swept through the palace gates. Mercer felt the familiar tension in his shoulders that came with royal arrivals, not nervousness. He'd done this hundreds of times, but today felt different. He'd been thinking about Diana more lately, especially with all the recent speculation in the press about that night in Paris. 27 years of silence, and still the questions wouldn't go away. Security vehicles first, then staff cars, and finally, the big one. Longer, heavier, windows tinted dark enough that you couldn't see inside even if you tried. It glided to a stop on the exact spot they'd marked earlier. Smooth as silk. Mercer didn't move, didn't even blink. His eyes stayed fixed on that invisible point, somewhere beyond the crowd. The thousand-wise stare that guards are famous for. Only his wasn't for show. It was the same focus that had kept him alive when being distracted for even a second could mean not coming home. The rear door opened, and King Charles stepped out. He looked every inch the monarch, navy overcoat, perfectly tailored, gloves fitted just right. That particular kind of careful dignity that comes with knowing every camera in the area is pointed at you. 75 years old, but he carried himself with the weight of someone who'd been preparing for this job his entire life. And for Mercer, seeing him step into the February light brought back another memory. Diana's voice from that same night in 1997. He's been planning this for years, Daniel, waiting for me to become inconvenient enough that removing he seems reasonable. Charles started his walk down the line of guards, each one snapping to attention as he passed. Rifle up, sharp salute, back to position. Like a perfectly timed machine, each movement crisp and exact. Charles acknowledged each man with a small nod. Sometimes a quiet word that the crowd couldn't catch. Behind the barriers, an American tourist was explaining to her teenage daughter how the ceremony worked. "See, honey, they all salute the king." It's been like that for hundreds of years, her daughter rolled her eyes. It's kind of silly, don't you think? All this pomp and circumstance. Maybe, her mother replied, but there's something beautiful about tradition. When Charles reached Mercer, nothing happened. No salute, no acknowledgement, not even a flicker of recognition that the King of England was standing 3 feet away. For Mercer, the moment felt like standing at the edge of a cliff he'd been approaching for 27 years. Every muscle in his body knew the movement. Right arm up, sharp salute, eyes front. He'd done it thousands of times. But today, Diana's voice echoed louder than protocol. "Don't let them rewrite why was." Charles paused for just a moment, probably expecting the movement that never came. His brow furrowed slightly, the first crack in his composed expression. In that pause, something passed between them. Not recognition exactly, but awareness. Charles had seen this kind of stillness before in men who'd made decisions they wouldn't be talked out of. Then he took another step, and another, continuing down the line. But something made him look back. Maybe it was the absolute stillness of the man he'd just passed. Not the glassy-eyed discipline of someone following orders, but something deeper, something that felt intentional. Or maybe it was the way the crowd's attention seemed to shift, sensing that something had gone off script. Charles stopped, turned around and walked back. The crowd sensed it immediately. That shift when something unscripted starts happening. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones that had been lowering rose again. A palace aide near the entrance checked his watch nervously. This wasn't part of the ceremony. "Sergeant," Charles said, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearest tourists to hear. "The king stands before you. A salute is in order." Mercer didn't blink, didn't breathe differently, didn't acknowledge the man in front of him any more than he would a pigeon landing on the pavement. Charles' expression tightened just slightly. The polite mask was still in place, but underneath you could see the first stirrings of irritation. "Perhaps you didn't hear me." I said, "Salute your king." Still nothing. The winter wind ruffled the plume on Mercer's bare skin, but the man beneath it might as well have been made of granite. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Is he allowed to just ignore him?" Another voice answered uncertainly, "I don't think so." Near the back, a middle-aged man in a flat cap nudged his wife. "Something's not right here. Guards don't just ignore royalty." His wife shushed him, but her eyes were fixed on the scene, unfolding in front of them. Maybe he has his reasons. Charles leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice but not quite whispering. "This isn't the time to be stubborn, Sergeant. You're on duty. Do as you've been instructed." The silence stretched and stretched and stretched until it became its own kind of answer. Behind Charles, his private secretary, a thin man with wire-brimmed glasses, shifted uncomfortably. He'd seen the king handle difficult situations before, but never quite like this. Never with someone who simply refused to acknowledge his presence. "A simple salute," Charles continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "That's all I've asked. Show the people that their king is respected by his guard." Near the rope barrier, a small girl tugged on her mother's coat. "Mum, why won't the soldier listen to the king?" Her mother looked uncomfortable. I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe he has his reasons," an older gentleman standing nearby overheard. He was wearing a small poppy pin on his lapel and carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd served. "That one's been to Afghanistan twice," he said quietly. "If he's not saluting, there's something we don't know." Charles straightened, his voice now pitched for the entire courtyard to hear. "Is this how the household division conducts itself, standing mute in the face of the crown?" Some tourists started looking genuinely uncomfortable, like they were witnessing a family argument in public. Others seemed riveted, sensing this was turning into something bigger than they'd expected. A young woman with a London accent whispered to her friend, "This is getting awkward." Her friend replied, "Look at his face though, the guards? He's not being disrespectful. He's being deliberate." "I'm certain," Charles continued, each word crisp as the winter air, "that ceremonial respect is not optional unless we've reached the point where protocol means whatever suits the mood of the man in uniform." The aristocratic edge was coming through. Now, the kind of tone that gets sharpened in drawing rooms where cutting someone down is considered an art form. Mercer didn't move, not even a twitch. His stillness had weight to it, a presence that somehow filled the space between them more completely than any response could have. The private secretary leaned closer to Charles's ear, whispering something urgent. "Sir, we should move this inside. The cameras." "No," Charles cut him off sharply, his voice carrying further than intended. "This ends here." A few tourists near the front exchanged worried glances. Someone whispered, "He's really losing it." The outburst seemed to snap Charles back to awareness of where he was. He straightened his coat, forcing his voice back to its controlled register. "I have always respected men who do their duty," Charles said, his voice dropping to something closer to ice. "But there's a certain kind of man who hides behind rules because he lacks the character to act when respect is owed." That landed like a slap. A woman in the crowd shifted uncomfortably and muttered to her companion, "That's a bit much, isn't it?" An American tourist whispered, "Is he always like this?" The veteran with the poppy pin spoke a little louder now, his voice carrying to those around him. "That guard's got more character in his little finger than most people have in their whole body. If he's not moving, there's a damn good reason." Behind Charles, his lead aide was checking his watch and glancing toward the palace entrance. Whatever was supposed to happen next was being delayed by this standoff, and you could practically see him calculating how badly this could go viral. A security officer near the side entrance spoke quietly into his radio. "We have a situation developing at the ceremonial post. Request guidance." The response crackled back. "Monitor only. Do not intervene unless specifically ordered. You may think this is all theatre," Charles continued. "Standing in the cold with a gun, you'll never fire. But the monarchy runs on traditions like these, and you are here to uphold them, not rewrite them to suit yourself." The crowd's mood was shifting. What had started as curious amusement was becoming something else entirely. People looked uncomfortable now, like they were seeing something they'd rather not. Charles gestured toward Mercer with one gloved hand. "A guard salutes the sovereign. That is the law of this courtyard, and it has been so for centuries." A younger aide took half a step forward, voice low. "Sir, perhaps we should. Failure to acknowledge your king." Charles cut him off, his failure to acknowledge the very crown you claim to serve. The temperature in the courtyard had shifted from formal to personal, from ceremonial to confrontational. This was no longer about protocol. It was about power, about who would blink first. In the crowd, people were starting to take sides. A group of teenagers near the centre began whispering among themselves. One of them, a girl with bright purple hair, spoke loud enough for others to hear. The guard's not doing anything wrong. He's just standing there. Her friend nodded. Yeah, but the king's getting properly wound up about it. Protocol exists to honour the crown, Charles said, delivering the words like a judge issuing a verdict, not to serve the egos of men who think themselves above it. And that's when something shifted in the crowd. A woman near the back, maybe in her 60s, stepped forward slightly. Her voice was clear and carried further than she probably intended. That man served with my son in Afghanistan. If he's not saluting, there's a reason. Another voice joined her. Some things matter more than protocol. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were taking sides. You could feel it happening. The way public sentiment was crystallizing around the figure in red, who had said nothing but somehow spoke volumes. The veteran with the poppy pin straightened his shoulders. I served 32 years, he said to those around him. I've seen good soldiers follow bad orders, and I've seen brave soldiers refuse to follow any orders at all. That man's showing us the difference. Charles tried one more time, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. Your behaviour is an embarrassment to your regiment and an insult to the monarchy itself. I will see to it you are removed from this post before the hour is out. It was meant to be the final word, the kind of dismissal that ends arguments and sends people scurrying. Only this time, it wasn't the end. For the first time since Charles had approached him, Mercer moved slowly, deliberately. His right hand shifted on the rifle's stock, adjusting his grip with the kind of precision that comes from decades of muscle memory. Not breaking formation, but making it clear that he'd heard every single word. The crowd sensed the shift immediately. Conversation stopped. Even the dignitaries in the background turned to watch. When Mercer spoke, his voice carried across the courtyard, low but clear enough for everyone to hear. I salute those who uphold the honour of the crown, he said, without turning his head or breaking that forward stare, not those who have defiled it. The sound that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp, a collective intake of breath from the crowd. Someone near the front whispered, "Did he just call him?" Charles's head jerked back slightly, his composure cracking for the first time. "Excuse me." Mercer's breathing remained steady, almost unnervingly so. When he continued, each word was delivered with the precision of a man who'd been waiting 27 years to say them. "Your Majesty," he said, still staring straight ahead. "I have stood guard for sovereigns who commanded respect without ever asking for it, for men and women who carried themselves with such dignity that a salute was given freely without thought." He let the words settle for a heartbeat before continuing. "But I will not salute a man who betrayed his vows to the woman the world knew as the Princess of Wales." Diana's name spoken aloud in that courtyard seemed to drop the temperature by several degrees. A ripple went through the crowd. Not just murmurs now, but distinct whispers of Diana passing from person to person. An older woman in the crowd wiped away a tear. A man who'd been filming lowered his phone entirely, suddenly understanding this was about something bigger than a viral moment. The private secretary behind Charles had gone pale. This wasn't just insubordination anymore. This was testimony from someone who'd been inside when it all happened. Mercer's voice didn't rise, but it carried the weight of something that had been held back for too long. Who humiliated her, diminished her while parading his affections for another in the shadows? A man who now wears the crown only because she is no longer here to stand in his way. Behind the rope barrier, you could hear Paul drawing sharp breaths. Someone whispered, "He's really doing this." Another voice, "Good for him." Charles's gloved hands tightened at his sides. The only visible sign that the words had found their mark. "I was there in her final months," Mercer continued, each word measured and deliberate. "Not in the photographs, not in the papers, but in the corridors and car parks where she spoke without cameras watching. I heard her fears. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I heard her speak of eyes that smiled while planning her disappearance. I promised her if the day came when her voice was gone, I would not let her truth be buried. The reaction was instant and visceral. Audible gasps, sharp intakes of breath, a woman putting her hand to her mouth. Even the palace aides looked shaken. In the crowd, a man pulled out his phone, started frantically typing. "This is going to be everywhere in an hour," he muttered to his companion. The veteran with a poppy pin nodded grimly. "About bloody time," someone said it out loud. A young woman near the barrier had tears streaming down her face. "I was 10 when she died." she said to no one in particular. I always knew something wasn't right. The security officer by the palace steps was speaking rapidly into his radio now. We need immediate media containment protocols. This is getting out of hand. The American mother, who'd been explaining the ceremony to her daughter earlier, now found herself struggling for words. Her daughter wasn't rolling her eyes anymore. She was listening with a kind of intensity usually reserved for history documentaries. Shh, told me, Mercer said, his voice never wavering. If something happens to me, remember I never wanted to vanish. And remember the ones who gained the most from my absence. Charles's carefully maintained composure was cracking, not broken, but visibly strained, a muscle tightened along his jaw. You gained the most, Mercer said quietly, his words carrying across the silent courtyard like smoke that wouldn't disperse, and within months the path was cleared for the woman who now stands beside you to take her place. The confrontation had transformed from a test of protocol into something much more personal, much more dangerous. If that is not by your hand, it is by your shadow, and the shadow is dark enough. For several heartbeats, the only sound was the winter wind moving across the courtyard and the distant snap of flags. I will not salute a man whose crown sits atop a history written in deceit, Mercer finished, his voice returning to that same steady calm. Not while I stand in the uniform of a regiment sworn to defend honour, not diminish it. The words hung in the space between them like an accusation that wouldn't fade. For several seconds that felt like minutes, Charles didn't move. His aides stood frozen behind him, their expressions carefully neutral, despite the tension radiating from their posture. Every eye in the courtyard was fixed on the space between the king and the guard, who had just laid bare 27 years of buried truth. When Charles finally spoke, his tone was controlled but ice-cold. Your words are slanderous, Sergeant. They are beneath the dignity of your post and will have severe consequences. Mercer's gaze never shifted from that point beyond the crowd. His voice when it came was quiet, but carried with perfect clarity. Truth does not fear consequence, sir. The phrase cut through the tension like a blade. Some in the crowd stilled entirely. Others exchanged glances that were equal parts shock and something approaching admiration. Near the rope barrier, the older woman was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. A young man in a black coat had stopped recording entirely, just watching with the kind of focus usually reserved for historic moments. The veteran with the poppy pin stepped closer to the barrier. That's what real courage looks like, he said to anyone within earshot. Standing your ground when it matters. The confrontation had shifted something fundamental in the courtyard. The formality of the palace had given way to something rarer, more human. The guard had spoken truth to power, and in doing so, he had tilted the entire moment away from the man wearing the crown. Charles's eyes stayed on Mercer for a long moment, searching for even the smallest break in that unyielding composure. But there was nothing. No flicker of regret, no hint of hesitation, only that same disciplined stillness, as if the words he had spoken were carved as firmly into him as the creases in his tunic. Behind him, his aides shifted subtly, sensing the stalemate had reached a dangerous edge. The private secretary leaned forward and murmured something urgent in the king's ear. Another aide tilted his head toward the palace entrance, a silent reminder of schedules and protocols still waiting. From the crowd, a voice called out, "Leave him be." Another followed almost immediately. He's done nothing wrong. The tone wasn't angry so much as protective, as if the guard now stood for something beyond himself. A security officer near the palace steps spoke into his radio again. "Sir, the crowd is becoming sympathetic to the guard. Recommend immediate withdrawal to avoid escalation." Charles's gaze lingered a few seconds longer, and then, almost imperceptibly, he exhaled through his nose. No command came to remove Mercer. No order for immediate discipline was issued. Instead, the king straightened, turning slightly toward his aides. Two of them stepped forward instantly, closing the gap. Words passed in tones too soft for the crowd to hear. And then, with a small nod, Charles began to walk toward the palace entrance. The shift was immediate. Security officers who had been bracing for intervention relaxed by degrees. The crowd's attention followed the retreating figure for a moment, but then drifted back to Mercer, still standing as though rooted to the spot. No victory was claimed, no punishment enacted on the spot. But everyone in the forecourt understood what they'd just witnessed. The king had approached expecting deference and left without it. As Charles disappeared beneath the archway, the air in the courtyard seemed to ease, not with relief, but with a knowledge that something irreversible had happened. The ceremony would go on, but something had been torn open in front of everyone present. Mercer hadn't moved since his final words. His rifle was still in its perfect ceremonial position, his gaze fixed on that same invisible point beyond the crowd. Whatever storm might follow, it would not shake him here in this place on this day. For several seconds after the king vanished, no one moved. The courtyard seemed caught between breaths, as if unsure whether the confrontation had truly ended. Then the murmurs began low at first, scattered, and then spreading through the crowd in ripples. "That man has more courage than half the people in that building," a London voice said clearly. A woman nodded. "It's not defiance if it's the truth." The American teenager turned to her mother. "Mom, what did he mean about Diana being alive if not for them?" Her mother's response was careful but clear. "He meant some people get what they want by making sure their competition disappears, honey." Not everyone who disappears chose to. Not everyone agreed with what they'd witnessed. A well-dressed gentleman in a tailored overcoat muttered that the guard should be thrown out by sundown for speaking that way to the monarch. But those voices were outnumbered by others, people who understood that what they'd witnessed wasn't just insubordination. Toward the centre of the barrier, the veteran straightened his posture. Without a word, he raised a small, precise salute toward Mercer. The gesture was quiet, personal, but those who noticed it seemed to understand its weight. A young woman with her phone still recording spoke to her camera. "I don't know what we just witnessed, but I know it mattered. That guard just risked everything to honour someone who's been gone for almost 30 years. That's not just duty, that's love." A young man with his phone in hand looked around at the crowd, then at the guard. "I thought this was going to be just another changing of the guard," he said to no one in particular. "Didn't think I'd watch history instead." Through it all, Mercer remained exactly as he had been since the first car entered the forecourt. He offered no acknowledgement to the whispers, the glances, or the private gestures of respect. And in a way, that silence spoke louder than any reply could have. It told the crowd that what had happened wasn't for applause or spectacle or the satisfaction of winning a public argument. It was about holding a line, one he had decided long ago would never be crossed. Within minutes, phones were lighting up across London as people shared what they'd witnessed. By evening, hashtags like #Hashmember, Diana and #Ruth would be trending worldwide. Royal correspondents would be working their sources trying to confirm what sounded too explosive to believe. But the story was already writing itself in real time. Videos from a dozen different angles were uploading to social media platforms. News editors were fielding calls from eyewitnesses. Palace communications staff were about to have the worst day of their careers. A BBC correspondent standing at the back of the crowd was already on the phone with her producer. "I need a live truck here now." She was saying, "This is bigger than anything we've seen since Diana herself." In the crowd, people weren't just witnessing history. They were becoming part of it. The woman who defended Mercer earlier was giving an impromptu interview to anyone with a microphone. The veteran with the poppy pin had been surrounded by tourists asking what he thought it all meant. But for those who had been there, no confirmation was needed. So they had seen a man stand up to power and refuse to bend, even when everything he'd worked for was on the line. Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer stayed at his post until the ceremony concluded and his relief arrived. Not another word was spoken. Not a movement betrayed the storm he had just weathered. The cold winter light settled over the forecourt, and the line of guards resumed their silent watch as though nothing had happened at all. But for those who had been there, nothing looked the same. So, what do you think? Was Staff Sergeant Mercer right to refuse the King's order for a salute? Should a royal guard ever break silence, even when the matter cuts as deep as personal principle? And here's the bigger question. In a world where truth gets buried under official narratives, does it take someone in uniform to finally speak what everyone's been thinking? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this moment gripped you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss our daily stories. If you know someone who needs to see this for themselves, share this video with them. There's another Royal Guard story waiting for you on your screen right now. Click it, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real authority doesn't demand recognition. It simply stands, and when it does, even kings discover they have nothing left